Thank you, and I'd like to thank Chris for asking me to come up here. It's kind of a great thing to be up here. One, let me tell you, I haven't slept much. I flew in last night. Didn't think the 2 hours would affect me that much, but I only get like 6 hours average, and hard to get 6 hours on that change. So I'm a little wired, and I haven't drank that much coffee either. It's just my normal persona. So, I'm really glad to be here. I obviously have studied theology and psychology, and really interested in this field. And when I heard that Chris was doing these evaluations, I was like, wow, this is great. I'm really glad you guys are doing this. Having gone through the studies and not being able to integrate, I think most of us that try to do integration realize it's very hard. It's not that easy. Today, we're going to talk about intercultural competencies, assessing Hispanic clergy, using the MMPI 2 and the 16 PF. Some of the things I'm going to go over just slightly because Dr. McNair and Dr. Hahn have covered it, and so I won't spend too much time. I am a clinician. I do most of the work in testing and teach testing as well as training, and the objectives are a little bit different, so I apologize for that, but anything that you want more of, I have included the articles, and the presentation is online if you are not able to see it or I pass over something, okay? So things we're going to talk about is development of the MMPI 2 with Hispanics, differences in the MMPI with white and Hispanic norms, using the MMPI 2 with Hispanic clergy in the United States, the use of the 16 PF 5, just a brief overview, cultural considerations and integration of identity models in psychometric assessments. So 2 perspectives to consider in assessment, as most of us know. Most of the origination of psychiatric and psychology and assessment really comes from a Eurocentric worldview, and I think that's why we're here. How do we make that change? Of course, as we know, the country has become really globalized, as Dr. Alshire mentioned it, and that is becoming a concern, which is the same concern that I had when I first went into school. The populations are changing drastically. So when you consider assessment, one of the things is to consider does culture and human behavior have a relationship between culture and psychopathology that leads to that personality dimension structures because they are similar across the cultures. From a theological perspective, we would say yes, right? Because we're all kind of have that same human capacity. And that is true. The problem is when you become so globalized and diverse, how we express that changes drastically. And I think that's the piece that really the U.S. is the one that's battling it because most other countries don't have that high level of diversity that we have, which is a great thing, by the way, but it makes our job a little harder to do. So when you consider assessment, you want to consider the human behavior that have a relationship between culture and psychopathology, but also what was found in Latin America, what's called allocentrism. And this indicates that for a certain group of people, some behaviors are just normal. That, where we wouldn't see them abnormal in another behavior. And sometimes when I always teach cross-cultural companies, I say, well, when does it stop being culture, right? If there's 100 maniacs, and only one normal person, can't say the 100 maniacs are right. They're just going to be crazy. It's just crazy. And that's the variance that we have to kind of work with, So just a brief history on it. For the test construction of the MMPI, you have to do 4 things. Linguistic equivalence, which means does the translation have the same meaning? And I think Dr. Hahn did a great job of, going through that, the problems that you have with that. The construct equivalence. Will the personality concepts be applicable across the cultures? The psychometric equivalence. You have to get local norms if the cultures are very different. And that is true. The difference that comes to it is acculturation. That's what's going to make the difference about that one piece. And again, I won't go too much in it because I think Dr. Hahn did a great job in covering a lot of that. Psychological equivalence beyond only a particular group or culture. So is the psychological meaning the same across the culture? And she again, did a great job in showing how it doesn't. Sometimes you have to look for those things. So now when you're talking about The biases in assessment. These are some of the biases that Butcher has found, and he's great, by the way. And I brought the book. Makes my job easy. Assessing Hispanic clients using the MMPI-2, MMPI-A. Guy's done it for 30, 40 years. I mean, just has really spent the time. He's kind of the authority on the MMPI. But he noted that there's a lack of culture-specific norms. Tests did not originate in the target culture because of the different values. Lack of standardized mechanisms that you can't account for acculturation. Conducting assessments in a quantitative manner as opposed to the other information, interview and observation. And I think for most of us that are assessors, we do realize that I'm just talking about one test, but we never really write a report based on one test, right? We kind of measure all the tests and kind of see where the truth is found in that aspect. And of course, lack of awareness of own ethnic identity. And that piece is a little bit new that I'll try to cover depending on time, is that ethnic identity across the peoples, meaning white identity, Latino identity, and so forth. That's a nuance that is really just not taught when you're doing assessment. Now with the MMPI-2, they did study it in Cuba, and Cuba was a great country to look at because Cuba was isolated. You know, they're just, all the embargoes kept them kind of separate from the American culture, but they still were open to using the MMPI-2, which, to look at them, it made a great way to assess, does the MMPI assess health problems in that country with just Latinos? So they adapted it completely to them to fit their population. The first Spanish translation, which was in 1993, was Garcia and Assange. They basically adapted it, and it's called the Garcia-Assange MMPI-2 Hispania. They adapted it to actually the Mexican culture, which is probably the best one to use, and you hear me say this, but if you ever have to use a translation, this is the one to use in the US. It just is well adapted, the norms are right. Then, you know, with that adaptation is where they went to Mexico, and they did a little translation with bilingual psychologists. They considered the semantics, the external validity. There was a 90% agreement, content readjustment, and then back translation. All of this being followed by Butcher, who does really well in translations. You translate it once, translate it back by the local people, then translate it back. But this one is probably the best one to use if you're going to do assessments with Latinos. In Mexico, and this is some of the things that they found when they did it, the equivalence research was 813 men, 1,100 women, compared to the US college normative sample. So men and women differed except on the L scale and 8 scale, as in US separate norms were needed. And that's because there weren't there. There was significant statistical differences between Mexican and American male universities, except on 4. Psychopathic. I don't know why that was the case, but they did find that to be a difference. The largest difference came in L2, which is depression and paranoia. Significant difference were found between Mexican and American female university students, except on F, hypochondria, and 3, hysteria. And of course, the largest difference in 5, which is masculinity and femininity. And they consider that because there is a huge different perspective between men in Latin America and the US, that being that men and women in the US tend to be more egalitarian in their perspective, whereas in Latin America, men tends to be more dominant, per se. There was a confirmed internal consistency, reliability, and discriminant validity, which is great. The differences did not show elevated pathological indexes as in the MMPI-1, which Dr. Hahn covered about that the MMPI-1 just had a lot of differences. This one, the MMPI-2, really did fare out much better, you know, across the cultures. And one, because it was used, you know, with basically a Mexican population. Now, they also did another study in the general study, I mean, in the general population, not college students, but just the general population in Mexico. And you can see the norms in the appendix. The books has them, and they're really great. With the general population in Mexico, Mexican men and women scored higher than American men and women on the same scales. The greatest differences was in cynicism, fears, and antisocial personality. Now, the fears were due more because of socioeconomic conditions, and of course, if you knew anything about Mexico, you know the country was in poverty. 63% of the population was in poverty. It's only been in the last 10 years, actually, when the U.S. recession hit, that the middle class grew. As far as antisocial personality, it was due more to different things that are considered antisocial in each culture. So, you know, these are the differences you're seeing as to why they're different. And I'm just giving you the differences that you would say, oh, why are they higher here, why are they lower here? Well, they have different perceptions of what means one and what means the other. Other studies results, Mexican people score higher on L than Americans, more inclined to project a good image, collective as opposed to individualistic. And that's true. You know, if you give an MMPI to a Latino, they tend to score higher, but I think it comes back from the collectiveness. You want to present well to strangers, to people that are not part of your immediate nuclear family. You know, things are not spoken about that openly. More traditional than American society. There's a fear of judgment from disclosure, which I mentioned, the strong family loyalty. Have difficulty understanding the double negatives. And I put Cantinflas, and that's just something to give you a little history. Cantinflas was a guy in the 20s and 30s, and he always wore his pants down below his rear end, but he always used double negatives to everything, and just confused you left and right. And you know, grammatically, double negatives are not grammatically wrong, right? But if you're not used to them, they confuse you. So it's not a culture that uses that, where the MMPI had a lot of that. It's like, you know, do you want to kill your mom, yes or no, or how many times? No, you don't. You know, it's just like, okay. And to them, that's considered kind of craziness, you know, because of this character who made it so popular that he would just confuse you about those double negatives, and they're not used. You know, while it's an indirect communicative language, it's either one or the other, but it's not using double negatives. And of course, low SES, difficult with comprehension. And that has to do, as again I said before, the country from Central America, and I want to make that difference, from Central America to Mexico, most of the people have been below poverty line, 63% or plus. Now, if we were considering South America, Latin America, it would be different because they have a different economic status. But my guess is, in my clinical work in testing Latinos and testing Latinos, and of course also doing clinical work with them, is that I rarely get to see South Americans in the office. Does that make sense? They don't particularly, they're pretty comfortable sometimes just going to an American for treatment. Most of the population that I interact with tends to be low SES. So that's a factor, just so you know, because of the immigration policy. The other thing is you don't have a lot of people from South America migrating to the U.S. It's a very expensive venture to begin with. And when they do migrate, they don't tend to be in our clinics or such. So of course, the MMPI has been translated and adapted in many countries: Puerto Rico, Argentina, Chile, Peru, and Spain. Castilian Spain, of course, because the Spanish that we speak is Castilian. There's 4 other Spanishes, but it comes from the Castilian. What was interesting about that one is the high equivalency of the Castilian and U.S. versions in general populations. There was an endorsement percentage of 0.85 for females and 0.875 males, which is very high. You wonder, wow, how can, you know, when you give this test to Spaniards in Spain, the equivalence is almost similar. I mean, we're talking 0.85 to 0.875. That's just not a very big variance. I think back is because of the culture, what I started with before, the Eurocentric mindset. Spain does not have the same acculturation problems or views that Latin America does coming into the U.S. Matter of fact, when I work with Spaniards, again, I don't find them in my neighborhoods. I find them usually upper class, well-to-do. You wouldn't even really know that there were Spaniards or Latin Americans if they didn't speak Spanish to you, or, you know, converse with them. So I think that really is a cultural perspective when you have that. But the great thing about it is it did provide what we call transcultural evidence. Once again saying, yes, we can find some similarities across the cultures. So the MMPI-2 in the United States, right? So as a clinician, I always come back, all of this makes sense. What does it make sense when I use it? Because really for me, a person that uses the test, that's where it comes down to. And the answer is, which one would you use? Well, you have to consider these issues. Bilingual, are they bilingual? Do they live, work, and attend school in the US? Do they read and comprehend English at a 6th grade level? And what are their code switching? Code switching is what I do, because I'm bilingual. I have to remember myself whether I'm thinking in Spanish or thinking in English, because at times I'll use both languages. So it's like, you know, and that's a factor for them. But the other piece you have to remember also when you're using it with this population is the fact that they went to school in America at this stage sometimes doesn't mean much anymore, because a lot of these kids are being passed through with poor comprehension skills. So hence, I'm interviewing a family, a Latino family, about 2 weeks ago and talking to a teenager. And I said, I speak to him in Spanish, and he says to me, he says, yeah, my mom's, because mom only speaks Spanish. And I said, well, why don't you speak Spanish? I thought that was what your mom taught you. He says, well, I went to school and I stopped speaking English. And I ain't gonna do that, but I ain't liking to talking. You know, I was like, what did you just say? So he's now 15 to 16 years old. And I said, you're not talking Spanish, but you're 2 years away from finishing high school, and you're not talking English very well either. Do you know what I mean? And we say that a lot. Oh my gosh, I am not learning English very well, and I'm losing the Spanish. Where's that going to leave you? See, this is a huge factor for this population. So when Butcher says this, I'm saying be mindful of what actual English comprehension do they actually have, which is usually when I use this norm, I give the WAIS, which is the measure for IQ, or the Woodcock-Johnson, or an achievement test to try and give myself a gauge of where they actually are in their English comprehension. And that'll help me to understand a lot of how I'm going to interpret the test, because the school systems really are not preparing bilingual students, in my opinion, to be grammatically well at the long stretch of the education system. So Hispanics that are not bilingual but monolingual Spanish, I would say, like I said earlier, use the Garcia-Assange MMPI-2. You probably are going to fare off fairly well. It has good measures, good norms. It has been used. You know, the norms are based on a Latino setting, and I would include Puerto Ricans as well, which they've done. You know, the research shows that it'll be okay. If the question is, well, if they say that they're English speaking and so forth, but they're not able to do it, I hate to say it, you might have to sit down and go through the questions, which I have often done, and go through questions and say, well, fill out the questions, let me see which ones you don't understand, and I will go through it with them and try and explore to them what meaning they're getting from it. It is laborious, I understand that. The other thing you need to consider is recent immigrant, using translation from one of the countries closest to the country of origin. And I mean, which country do they, you know, feel most comfortable with? You know, if it's an Argentinian, well, you can have an Argentinian translation. If it's a Chilean, you can have a Chilean translation. The problem we run into is the Central American population, which, you know, for our group, you know, Central America is becoming highly evangelized. So hence, a lot of the people that you run into are already evangelicals coming here. But the measure that's closest to them would be the one from Mexico. And of course, as I said before, and Dr. McNair mentioned it, there's variance, you know, about how they interpret that, because the language, as well, it is Spanish, the dialects have changed. So that's something to consider. which piece, what to do on that part, and it isn't an easy answer by any means. However, the English and Spanish have a booklet and audio tape formats. The Mexican version of the MMPI 2 booklet, El Manual Moderno, they use U.S. norms except when using the Mexican version or the one for Spain and Chile that have their own norms. These are the only two that do have their own, Spain and Chile, which you can use that one. However, there was a normative subset sample of Hispanic individuals in the one for the U.S. population. And that's fair to okay as well. However, there is no current sample, normative sample for Spanish-speaking American population. It's very costly. I mean, that's really, the best truth I can give you. To locate 1,000 Spanish-speaking Latinos with the same, that say that they have been in America, they speak Spanish in America, is hard to do. And that's really one of the biggest reasons, funding to make this possible. That would give you, across the board, a good substantial normative sample that we just don't have. But I say again, use it in caution with other tests that we all do. Avoid interpretation of the psychopathology 5, which are in the MMPI. Says my battery is low, by the way. If you have, so I'm assuming it's okay. Just FYI. Sorry about that. Thing is saying battery low and it might shut down. But anyway, avoid interpretation of the psychopathology 5 with the MMPI. There's just not enough research for it in the validity with Hispanics or the Latin American populations. I just pushed the button. So you know what I mean? I don't even interpret the 5 because I know this, and I'm like, why am I going to find something else about that? So just keep that in mind. So, interpretation guides with Hispanics in the U.S. The FNL scale are slightly higher. It's lack of acculturation, the reason. And I'll touch on acculturation if we get a chance, but I go with the assumption that most of you have been exposed to what acculturation is. Infrequent respondent, many times is considered the immigrant stress because they're here. Now, the population varies on documentation. If they're not documented, they clearly are going to show a higher level because you're always concerned. And to show you a quick sample, I'm an immigrant, but where I go, I carry my passport. How many of you carry your passport traveling over here? Exactly. That's the difference. I carry my passport because I am, well, one, that I do also look Middle Eastern, and they constantly ask me for other reasons. But I've just learned, just carry my passport. Here, go ahead. You know what I mean? So it's just one of those things. Well, I'm a citizen, but I still carry my passport. Many of them are not citizens. They're undocumented. And I know the last group that we tested, I think only one of them had documentation, so that's going to be higher because of that purpose. The scale 5, it's variable among the Hispanic groups. It's unclear why. Traditions, religion, inferiority complex, SES. And that is something to consider, because the groups are so different. Something I've found is that the closer you are to America as a country, the higher your inferiority rate is of reporting. And I think it's because this idea of America being so close, the farther you're away from America, the less the inferiority complex was. And you don't have that much contact, so you don't feel that same idea to say, I have to be this way. Does that make sense? With Puerto Ricans, we saw this a lot because they don't have any immigration problem. They can come off the island any day of the week. And yet they were showing these same situations. So it's kind of looking at that sometimes it's not even documentation. It's the influence of the American culture upon that culture. And by the way, in Puerto Rico, you speak Spanish. Even though it's an American colony, I shouldn't say colony, territory, right? they had the option to become a state about 10 years ago, and they all opted to continue to be a territory. So, you know, there's different things as to why it happens, but I do know that much, that depending on where they're coming from in Latin America determines a lot of their perspective and how they're going to answer the questions. The other one is hypochondriasis and health concerns. Most of them did report somatic concerns, and I think Dr. Hahn, some a little bit cross-variance with our cultures is, with Latin Americans, particularly Central America to Mexico, speaking about mental health issues is just not common. We're still the largest underserved population in mental health services. You don't. You go see what I would here would be a chiropractor. You go see the shaman, you know, or you go to the doctor, and the way emotions are expressed are through physical elements. Now, South America, Latin America, that's different. They will express to you their emotional situations, so you have a better chance of getting what's going on, but not from Central America on. So the other piece is determination if they can read English. And these are the things that you look for. Cannot say, you know, the variable, Ventren, infrequency scale, true-false percentages. And you're looking for true-false percentages, you're looking for a 30% or greater. And that's obvious, right? But when you're looking for 30% greater, it's because it tells you right away they did not understand the test. I think I have a sample here, and the one sample I'll show you is, I think I had to give it like 2 or 3 times. And I don't know if he was just doing it just quickly, but it just went down. You know, true, false, false. It's like, why? They didn't understand it, so they would just answer it. So when I see 30% or more, even though it's invalid, I'm trying to assess whether they really understood the comprehension of the test. So here's the case sample. So this is, and maybe this will help to shed some light on it. This is a 21-year-old, single, bilingual, Hispanic male. He was born in Orange, California. However, heritage is from South America, Bolivia in particular, had a normal birth and development milestones within normal limits, and described themselves as an evangelical Christian, but rejected by his Catholic family. He converted. So there's a lot of rejection, familial, you know, and for those of us who kind of understand that field, coming out of the Catholic system, which is so collective and unified familially, to come out of that is very hard, which is, I think, one of the biggest, or one of the hardest things about evangelizing in Mexico, because the Catholic Church has a huge influence on that, and, you know, it just doesn't take well to people converting. So his MMPI-2 results were valid indicators of personal functioning, you know, score 65 on L, and that's why I put with extreme caution, because he was over. He responded to all of the items on the test. He responded to similar items consistently, so I didn't have any problems there. He did not respond randomly to the test items, but was able to discriminate them. And he denied experiencing any significant pathology. However, in the second part of the test, he endorsed items that were relevant to one area of difficulty, and that's faking bad. The way he took the test, as you noticed from L, was very defensive and wanted to present in a favorable light. Once again, showing the consistency, right, with a Latino community. He wants to present that everything is okay, there's nothing going on. But then on the MA, he got a 74. At this point, he's presenting himself in a positive note that seemed unrealistic. You know, 74 is high. He expressed that his idea in wrong was better than that of other people. This is his report. He felt that he was unfairly mistreated by the lack of support from his mother after he changed his faith, and that others that are not of his faith mistreated him. I'm putting this in because it contributes to his responding. He's being rejected from his family for leaving the Catholic faith. He's become a Christian believer, right, that has enlightened him to other things, but there's no transition point between the Catholic culture, his Hispanic culture, and now an evangelical, you might say, culture. He's having a hard time. He says, no, I'm right, they're wrong. Their Catholic views are wrong. Pedro indicated that he was not a person that trusted others and seemed concerned that other people were not honest about their lifestyles. And this is common, I think, for a lot of Latinos that convert into evangelical Christianity after coming from a Catholic faith. You kind of tend to reject the other. No, what they're saying is not good. This is the right way, which created some of the high scores on the synonism. Pedro appeared to be a person that was very focused with details and perfection, such as he expressed that he was a very organized, and that if there was something that was not organized, then he would organize it because it would bother him. And he scored high on aggression and hostility. Now, there's two things to this case. One is he's coming out of a Catholic family culture, converted into Christianity. So I'm now having to consider, one, the scores on the MMPI, but I'm also having to consider the religious conversion. Because if faith has it, when people convert, and I didn't put the study in here, when people convert into the Christian faith, they tend to have a very black and white perspective of faith. So hence it transcends over there. It's a very black and white, and I'm seeing this more of him than nothing else, and it's helping him to maintain control of what's going on in his whole makeup, in the whole family system. So, it says, Pedro's internal conflict seemed to surface in his interactions with others. He did not trust people and thought that they were selfish and uncaring, but his faith required that he serve others, which is where you had those skills being elevated, because he was conflicted. He didn't trust his family. He didn't trust other people, but yet his faith told him to go forth and serve. Well, most people that convert want to convert their family members. Catholicism does not want to be converted by them. Here you have that internal conflict. This was evidence in his inability to form any intimate relationships during his growing years, and that's a grammatical error. And love his love above their rejection of him. That's a grammatical error, FYI. There appeared to be a strong resentment towards his mother for not standing up for him when he felt persecuted by his family. And that's because his family really did persecute him because he had converted into Christianity. So they didn't take well to him, and he really internalized that, and of course internalized from a more clinical perspective, someone who didn't feel protected by his mom, but totally missed the cultural barriers that were going on in the cultural conflicts that were occurring with him, because no one helped him to transition over to the faith or discipline him. Discipled him. But that is not a nuance, right? Most people that convert into the faith do not get discipled right away. So he's living kind of a normal pattern, unfortunately, in a hostile environment, this being his family. There appeared to be a strong resentment, like I said. His strong devotion to his faith has led him to have higher expectations from others, even when they are in authority over him. For instance, Pedro stated that he did not want to be like his father, but wanted his father to accept his faith. Also, he refused to attend the church connected to the Christian school he attended because it was not like the church he had grown up in. And that's also a factor of the immaturity of the faith that he's demonstrating. But yet it's coming up high on the MMPI. And it really is, he's not gathering that, you can go to this church, you can go in that church. But because it was so central to his protection, it made it difficult for him to see shifts that were practically normal, by any other standards. He also expressed a strong sense of confidence in his leadership with directing his younger siblings towards his faith. He said that as the older brother, they would do whatever he did. And that meaning that he took it upon himself that he had to protect his younger siblings and direct them, as he was the only Christian in the family. and realized this was a good thing without recognizing some of the changes that were also occurring with his family in regards to him. And that's something that I'll touch on in a minute, because what Pedro is really talking about here is his identity. One, his identity culturally, and his identity religiously, which is often not touched when we look at these profiles. Pedro felt very committed to his faith, and it appeared that it was a large source of his emotional stability. However, his internal conflict demonstrated that it is possible that Pedro felt apprehension because he had to honor his parents and do what was right, but he could express his feelings, he could not express his feelings towards his parents. And that's what creates an internal conflict. May incur internal conflict for all of us, but clearly he was having this situation. It seemed that while he withheld a lot of aggression and has done so through most of his life, for instance, Pedro reported that when someone upset him, he would not confront the individual, but waited until he became frustrated. You know, and some of this is seen in passive aggressiveness behavior. Overall, it appeared that Pedro felt better than others because of his near-death events and his faith. And that's because he did have a couple traumatic events that he had lived through, and he felt that God had pulled him out of those situations. So in one instance, you would think that that would give him a sense of more grace. On the contrary, it empowered him to feel that, well, God is really going to protect me through this, and they're wrong about what they're talking about. You know, and this is all in the interview process that I gathered the information to try and understand why this profile had come up as it did. So just to conclude, that was the sample on the MMPI. And of course, I put all the articles in there that if you want to consider them, that explore more about the Latino culture, but also some of the articles that will help you to understand how to interpret the MMPI. Now with the 16PF, I'm being mindful of the time, it's been translated into 35 languages. And you can actually take it, if you go to their website, you can take it in various languages. They have it up there and it's really well set up. It's a great situation, really. The problem is it's only been developed mostly in a homogeneous group with Caucasians. That really is the biggest problem with the 16PF. There's no norms for Hispanics in the US. So, of course, there's many concerns with intercultural competency because of its development. It has the 5 global skills: extroversion, anxiety, tough-mindedness, independence, and self-control. So that is the one thing with the 16PF. This is an article that I went over. It's from 1990. Whitworth and Perry, they administered it to 3 separate groups. White Americans were tested in English, Hispanics were tested in English, and a Hispanic group was tested in Spanish. The greatest differences were among Anglos or white Americans who took it in English and Hispanics who took it in Spanish, naturally, right? The second difference was among the Hispanics tested in English and the Hispanics tested in Spanish. The smallest difference was among white Americans and Hispanics that tested in English. Grant you that we're not accounting for acculturation, and you know, Dr. Hahn talked about which acculturation measure to use. She's actually very right. There's just not enough evidence about what that brings to the table. You know, and I use them sometimes, and sometimes I don't use them because there's just not enough robust information to how to balance that. Gender elevations: male scored high on scales M and QI. Female scored high on scales I, L, and O. So here's the breakdown, just an overview. On faking good and faking bad, the group that was just tested in Spanish was obviously the highest. On reasoning, it was white Americans. On dominance, white Americans. Social boldness, the Mexican group that was tested in Spanish. On sensitivity, the Mexican group that was tested in Spanish. On vigilance, which is another word for paranoia, was the Mexican group who tested in Spanish. Obvious reasons, probably immigration status. Abstractness is white Americans. Privateness, Mexican Americans who only spoke Spanish. Openness, I didn't put openness to change. Self-reliance, white Americans. And tension, white Americans. So the difference came this way. 10 out of the 12 scales showed differences between Americans and Hispanics that took the test in Spanish. Ethnicity and language mattered. That really was the factor. I mean, you know, you just didn't have enough to demonstrate why they were going there. Americans scored higher in intelligence, dominance, sensitivity, self-sufficiency, and imagination, and a high drive than other groups, which are considered positive attributes, you know, for the most part. Americans scored lower on suspiciousness and insecurity, which tend to be negative attributes. Hispanics who took the test in English scored higher on suspiciousness and insecurity, which are negative attributes considerably. And then in gender, males were high on scale M and QI. Females were high on scales I, L, and O. The results questioned the adequacy of the Spanish version, which is, you know, it's legitimate, and they determined that it needs more cultural considerations. However, there was no great significance with Americans and Hispanics taking it in English. So the reality comes back to, again, to acculturation. If you have a Latino that's been raised in America for the most part, speaks English for the most part, and really has been assimilated fairly well, you're not going to see that variance at all. It's the other groups that have immigrated recently, that have come to America and are still trying to acculturate. So, you know, with the 16PF, all I can say is I use it. I use it with caution, knowing these things. It's the same thing to be mindful of what the MMPI says. If you're wondering why I'm saying, well, you're using a study from 1990, right? That's 20 years ago. Thing is, nothing really new has come up since then addressing this problem. I did have an article on Ellis and Me 2000 who try to do differentiation, functioning, item, and tests, which they were trying to sort out basically where one group belongs to, can you also identify it within the majority group and within their subgroup? And let me tell you, once you get into statistical play, it could get really confusing as to what we're trying to sort out. But the reality is there just hasn't been enough research done by the 16PF bunch. You know, so that's where that's at. So far, so good. So here's something to consider, as I said earlier, with integrating the MMPI and the 16PF with Hispanic clergy. I've already mentioned, you know, that cultural competence is just that, a sensitivity to what you're doing. The views of how you look at treatment and assessment play a huge part. And this is a known thing. If you look at it from an ethic perspective, you're basically saying that it applies to everyone. If you're looking at it from a multicultural perspective, you're saying we have to consider the cultural sectors within each group. I was trained to look at both. I can't separate one from the other. That's, you know, I was trained in doing assessments with just Spanish-speaking groups. Hence, it's very hard for me to separate, to just use a measure without looking at it from that perspective, because that's the way I was trained. So some of the things that I encourage and that's helped a lot with these assessments is the use of identity models in assessment. When doing psychometric assessments of patients from different cultural backgrounds, it helps to understand the patient's worldview, view of mental health service, and what the patient believes is going to help him. I included in the resources Aponte's framework model for treatment, which I'll show you, and his PowerPoint presentation of the things that affect Latinos. Aponte's done really a lot of good work in addressing these issues. He was at UCLA, now he's at Kentucky. I always wonder about that move, you know. He did all his great work at UCLA, and then he moves to Kentucky. But the truth is, the southern states have I guess when you become famous, you get to go to, another university. I say it in just because the southern states have actually had a huge increase of Latino population in the last 10 years. So I think, there's a recognition. I think 3 years ago, Tennessee had like a 600% jump, of Latino percent jump within a few years. But coming back to why I use models of identity, it's simple, because when you bring acculturation into trying to explain results from an MMPI, you have brought in identity. Acculturation is a sector of identity. So hence, if you're not aware of how using identities for different groups, you really are not going to be aware of how that really applies. It's just a basic one, logical procession. Also, it increases, like I said, the awareness. And this is also that it's often not considered the personal identity in relation to the person identities being evaluated. It reduces its biases and increases incorporation of cultural factors impacting the assessment process. This is Aponte's model for treatment. And, as you can see, he's trying to cover how many things are really in play with the Latino immigrant or the Latino person trying to work with the system. And I say again, a group that rarely uses mental health services. So when you're saying, I'm going to give you this battery of tests, why? I'm not crazy. Do you know what I mean? There's a just very poor psychoeducation of what benefits a psychological battery can do. Actually, before I do treatment and assessment, I spend a great amount of time on psychoeducating the family of what it's going to be used for, what is it going to do, and what can it help us with. Because I already know that there's this heart resistance to it. So here we are with the acculturation. If you know how to use identity models with acculturation, you can quickly begin to first evaluate where the person is. Are the enculturation, of course, enculturation being an individual socializing into their own cultural group. If they're more in that group, then it's going to be harder, and they're going to report differently. Acculturation, are they assimilated? Consists of shifts towards the dominant culture and rejection of one's own culture of origin, or separation. Individuals that reject the majority culture and retain their cultural identity. Marginalization, did they feel out of it, Not really part of either their own group or even the majority. That's Pedro, by the way. He did not feel accepted by his own group, and nor did he have an ability to really assimilate to the American culture because he didn't see himself as them either. Biculturalism, as Dr. Hahn has pointed out, you're now a bicultural person actually has built the bridges. You can go between both cultures, and you're doing fairly well. That you understand one to be good and have bad things. You understand the other one to be good and to have bad things. Bilingualism, the level of proficiency in Spanish and English, which I've already mentioned. And of course, the moderating variables that Aponte points out, and that's race, language, religion, acculturated group, cultural characteristics, dominant and non-dominant influences. So I've presented to you, and I give you this one because I'm working with Latinos, is the model that they tend to go by. This is an integrated model. There's various, models that you can use, but this is kind of an integrated model of how they process through becoming acculturated in America. It's first casual, they're going through it. They're just kind of they want to be part of the system, the American system in particular, because they value it. For Latinos by and far, Central America to Mexico, they view the American system as a good system, per se, because of economic well-being. So they want to be part of that system. Cognitively, as a result of negative distorted message, 3 erroneous belief systems about Latinos or Chicano heritage becomes incorporated. Association of ethnic group membership with poverty and prejudice. Assimilation to white society is the only means of escape, which is what I was mentioning, and assimilation is the only possible road to success. And that is probably the thing that I notice with Latinos the most. They assimilate highly. into the American culture. And that's a big factor because that means they haven't really gone back and forth. They're only in one section of the model. The consequences becomes a fragmentation of ethnic identity, becomes very noticeable and evident. The person feels ashamed, embarrassed by ethnic markers such as name, accent, skin color, cultural customs, and so on. And I actually, I don't know if I mentioned this, but I went to Dallas Theological, which is just like, 20 minutes from here. And when I first came to this state, it was probably my first exposure to Latinos who had been here for, since Texas was Texas, or since it was part of Mexico. And I met a lot of Latinos that no longer spoke Spanish. And I remember one guy in particularly asking me, he was very abrasive towards me, and I didn't quite understand. I said, well, why don't you speak Spanish? He was actually much darker than me and so forth. And he says, well, my parents did not want me to talk with an accent, so they prevented me from speaking Spanish. The tragedy is he spoke with a very thick accent. And I have an accent as well. But, his family had become so assimilated, which is the irony that I should be in Texas saying this. In Texas and in California, there was a push to now allow bilingualism and to just speak speak English. We, being the liberals in California, pushed bilingualism, and now we have Latinos that don't speak English or Spanish well because the system didn't work well. You know what I mean? So we got cut on both ends, and that's a tragedy for the whole situation. But that's why we're now running into these factors. The other stage is working through. Two major dynamics distinguish this stage. First, the person becomes increasingly unable to cope with the psychological distress of the ethnic identity. Second, the person can no longer be a pretender in identifying with an alien ethnic group. The person is propelled to reclaim and reintegrate this own ethnic identity fragments. And then, of course, the last part is successful resolution. This stage is exemplified by greater acceptance of his or her own culture and identity, and there's an improvement in self-esteem in a sense that ethnic identity represents a positive and successful promoting. So that's kind of the stage you want to go through, that yes, it doesn't have to be an either or, but I think many times it gets placed in that situation and it makes it very hard for them. Now, I included this one as well, only because it's a majority culture that I'm working with when I'm considering Latinos, and it's called the integrated white identity models, which is basically, helping people who are not minorities understand their identity process in how they relate to an ethnic group. And it just goes through the simple process of how it is pre-exposure, pre-contact to a different ethnic group. I think Dr. McNair made a great point when he began, is that, the white culture hasn't done as well to integrate, which is why the schools are predominantly white. But I think this is a huge factor because there hasn't been a shift to really evaluate how we come across to them. And let me say this, with identity models, I find the same problem with minorities. Latinos themselves don't always recognize where they are in relation to the majority culture. Once that's achieved, it actually makes it makes greater progress in being able to continue with the process much more successfully. And of course, the exposure begins, then the conflict centers on the conflict over developing racial relations knowledge. At this point, there's an expansion of knowledge of racial matters that is facilitated by interactions with members of minority groups. However, this discovered new information challenges the individual to acknowledge their own whiteness and examine their own cultural values, which I think has already been mentioned. You start to realize, oh wow, I do have a lot of values that are actually not so different, and you become a pro-minority, anti-racism. Let me just say, I don't think that everyone has to go through this process. I'm just giving you an integrative piece of the models. So there's two reactions to this. One is the first response is a strong minority stance, and third, there's a experienced self-focused anger and guilt over the previous conformity to white socialization, as well as anger directed towards the white culture in general. I usually see this situation when I'm training Caucasian psychology students. They don't quite understand how they're coming across, because I work in community mental health, and we have to generally be very politically correct and diversely correct, because we serve the whole county of Los Angeles, which is like 12 million people. So we have a gamut of diversity, you know, and psychology white students have the hardest time with this, because they come with the understanding that it's just so, and it's just not going to work that well. So they run into a lot of conflicts in working with minorities. That doesn't mean that at the end of the day, you won't be as efficient as someone else. Does that make sense? And then retreat into the white culture, of course, when you realize that, you know, no, I don't want to change and I'm happy where I'm at. You know, the idea is that you go back into a white culture and refuse to integrate or be part of the diverse culture. And then, of course, in the last stage, there is a redefinition and a reintegration of, okay, I don't have to choose either or. And I think that is the piece with assessment, that you don't have to choose either or. We just have to consider everything that's before us in making these assessments. These are the articles that I've given you that I think will, you know, further explore some of this. Apontes, working with Latino and Latina clients, I think that he points out very well what things they're facing with the MMPI. Butcher, 50 historical highlights of the MMPI. Lucio Reyes and Scott, the translation adaptation. Scott, Butcher, Young, and Gomez, the Hispanic MMPI across 5 cultures. It is the MMPI for adolescents. However, they kind of get a good presentation about how it was done across 5 countries. You know, and so I always like that, because I think, okay, it's showing a lot of good variance to look for. And Velázquez and Chavarria, Carl, Callahan, and Garcia and Castellanos, assessing bilingual and monolingual Latino students with translation, and that was the initial study. Well, these are just my references that you can look at. This is the book that I normally use, because I think he's done a great job. It's not just him. Butcher has done a lot of good work, but it's also Caibia, who's Puerto Rican, Lucio, and Garrido, who are Mexican descent and working in Mexico, and of course, Guide to Psychological Assessment with Hispanics. It gives a good overview, but nothing will take away from you doing the interview. I was taught that, and Butcher makes it a good point. A lot of psychometric assessors just look at the numbers, and that's like 101 testing. Don't just look at the numbers. Then, even if you were giving a test, if I'm a Latino and I give it to a Latino and I can't just look at the numbers. He says you cannot do that. The interview process is so huge about explaining what's going on and what could happen differently. Thanks for your audience. Really appreciate you guys listening.